Alright, so this chapter is about neural networks, and neural networks are actually the fundamental part of deep learning. Okay, so in this chapter, we're gonna learn how neural networks work and then how we can train the neural network models. Okay, and if we stack lots of neural network layers, that is just deep learning. Okay, so in this chapter, first we're gonna talk about the brain neural network and the artificial neural networks. And then we'll see the history of artificial neural networks really briefly. And then we'll talk about neural networks and forward propagation and backward propagation. And then as an appendix, we can discuss some early neural networks. And I want to start from neuron doctrine. So in the human brain, the nervous system consists of neurons and discrete individual cells interconnected through synapses. This is how we understand our brain. Okay, so the brain is based on the neurons. And before this neuron doctrine, there was another kind of idea about our brain, which is the reticular theory. So in this theory, they understood the brain as a single continuous network, so which is kind of the opposite of neuron doctrine, right? So in AI systems, we have similar kind of doctrine because artificial neural networks are inspired by brain neural networks. So we have something like a neuron doctrine in AI systems too. So something like the societal mind. In this book, Marvin Minsky argued that the human intelligence was derived from thousands of simple agents working in concert, something like neurons. And Jeff Hawkins actually argued that we have only one algorithm in our brain, so we don't need a lot of different algorithms to train our brain. We have just one algorithm. In this chapter, when I say just neural networks, it means artificial neural networks. Artificial neural networks are computational models inspired by brain. Some people might want to say artificial neural networks are computational models imitating brain, but artificial neural networks work quite differently from actual brain in many ways. Okay, so it's safe to say that artificial neural networks are inspired by brain neural networks. So in the brain neural networks, we have neurons, but in the artificial neural networks, we have nodes for processing units. And in our brain, we have a synapses to connect all the neurons, and we can implement that with weights in the artificial neural networks for connections. And this figure it was drawn by Cahal in 1905. Actually, he observed lots of neurons with microscope and he drew with his pencil. Okay. And based on this drawing, he got this idea. So our brain is based on the neurons and the synapses, nodes and the connections. And then when we approximate really simply, then this is artificial neural networks. We have a node corresponding to neurons, and we have a connections corresponding to synapses. Now, let's talk about the history of neural networks. And in this class, we're not going to go through all the details of the neural network history, but I'm going to look at the rough flow and the main events and some names. Okay. So arguably, neural network began in 1949 by Donald Hebb, who proposed Hebbian learning. So arguably, he is the father of neural networks. Okay, so even though he proposed this algorithm to train neural networks, but we couldn't see any working algorithms. Okay, but in 1958, and Frank Rosenblatt proposed perceptron. And perceptron is a single layer neural network. Actually, it has more layer, but perceptron has only one trainable layer. And Based on perceptron, Frank Rosenblatt actually demonstrated some system which can recognize some alphabetic characters. Okay, so people got surprised and excited. So people started believing in artificial intelligence or neural network. But Marvin Minsky, who was, by the way, a rival from high school. Anyway, Marvin Minsky, by the way, he's an MIT professor who proved that Rosenblatt's perceptron is kind of limited. Okay, so we couldn't solve a real problem with the perceptron. So Marvin Minsky actually proved that a perceptron cannot solve complicated problems. And then in 1986, finally, backpropagation was proposed by David Romerholt, Jeff Hinton, and Ronald Williams. And by these backpropagation algorithms, and now we can train the deep neural network. But the computing power was back then. Computing power was limited, so we couldn't see anything great. But in 1995, Vemnick and Cortez proposed SVM, which is a simpler machine learning algorithm. I mean, the mathematical background is more complicated, but to train, it was easier to train than the neural network. So people loved SVM. So people didn't use neural network for a while, but all the important research about the neural network was done in the 1980s. So even now, when we read some papers in deep learning or neural network, then when we track the citations, then sometimes we end up with 1980s papers. Okay, and then in 1990s or in 2000s, people didn't like neural networks. So basically, there have been ups and downs in neural networks. Sometimes people loved, sometimes people hated. Okay, in 2006, deep neural network was kind of proposed. The history of deep learning is not that simple. Okay, it's not that simple because people believe that the deep learning has started in 2006 or so, maybe in 2012. But all important theories and algorithms are dated back to 1980s or 1990s. From this slide on, we're going to talk a little more of the history. Okay, but the history is not a real part of this class. So if you're interested in the history, then you can read articles and you can read the books and so on. So I'm going to go through these a couple of slides really quickly. Okay. So first of all, as I said in the beginning of this semester, we have two schools for AI. First one is computationalism and second one is connectionism. So we can think of Turing machine and neural networks as an example. And they actually competed for prestige and funding. So when the computationalism was up, then the connectionism was down. So there were ups and downs between these two approaches. And the perceptron was one of connectionism approach. And when the perceptron was proposed, Marvin Minsky actually proved that this perceptron cannot solve the complicated problems. And before 1986, after 1950s, and before 1986, there were a couple of important neural network architectures from Steven Grossberg and Cohen and John Hoffield, and these algorithms are really popular. So each of these would be one sub-chapter of pattern recognition or machine learning textbook. Okay. So Stephen Grossberg with Gail Carpenter proposed ART, which is a new principle of self-organizing. And the Kohonen actually proposed the Kohonen map, or a self-organizing map. And in 1982, John Hopfield proposed Hopfield network, which is a recurrent neural network. And three of these, ART and SOMS and Hopfield networks are really popular neural network architecture. And by the way, in 1983, reinforcement learning was proposed by Bartow and Sutton and Anderson. And in 1985, Baltimore machine was proposed. So Baltimore machine is kind of general machine, and there is a restricted Baltimore machine. Restricted Baltimore machine, or RBM, is really popular, but Baltimore machine is a general machine. In theory, it is good, but it is too general, so computationally it's too expensive to solve back then. So RBM, restricted Baltimore machine, was used. Anyway, before 1986, without backpropagations, there were a couple of important neural network architectures. And finally, in 1986, backpropagation was proposed by Hart, Hinton, and Williams. And also, this one was discovered by Paul Webos, okay, in 1974 in his PhD dissertation. So technically, the credit of backpropagation was given to Paul Webos, but back then, there was no internet, there was no email, and they couldn't communicate with other researchers, and many people didn't know anything about backpropagation. So in 1986, these people wrote a book. Okay, and then since then, backpropagation got popular, and all the researchers started using backpropagation in their neural networks. And in 1989, Yano-kun proposed convolutional neural networks, and CNN is the first neural network architecture which is working on real problems. And the CNN is kind of combination of neocognitron and backpropagation. So neocognitron was proposed by Professor Kusima, but in the neocognitron, he proposed the architecture, but he couldn't use backpropagation because he didn't know about backpropagations, because he proposed neocognitron in 1980. So in 1989, Yano-kun actually took that neocognitron and the backpropagation, so he combined. So he put the backpropagation algorithm on the neocognitron, and as a result, he published CNN. And in 1997, and Jürgen Schmidhuber's group actually proposed long short-term memory. Actually, recurrent neural network was proposed in 1986, but the conventional recurrent neural network, or RNN, was not that effective. So in 1997, Jürgen Schmidhuber group proposed LSTM, and even now, when we use RNN, actually we use LSTM or GRU. And in 2006, Jeff Hinton and Ruslan Salakutinov had one paper published in Science Journal titled Reducing the Dimensionality of Data with Neural Networks. So this is the first deep learning paper opening the new deep learning era. But ironically, in this paper, they didn't say anything about deep learning. They used the deep neural networks. So they actually stack a lot of layers of neural network, and then finally they proposed a new idea to train the deep neural networks. So before this paper, people wanted to stack layers, but when we stack multiple layers, then the backpropagation algorithm didn't work. So Jeff Hinton and Russ, they actually proposed a pre-training. So instead of training the whole network with backpropagation, then they proposed to train the layers separately. So they train the first layer, then they train the second layer and the third layer with different algorithm, and they combine all of them and they train all the network with backpropagations. Okay, so since then, people realized that deep neural network could work. Okay, and then since then there are lots of techniques and tricks to improve the efficiency of the training. So since then, there was an explosion of deep learning. But one of the most popular and important paper was Alex Kripsky's paper, basically from the same group. He had this paper published in the New Rips, and since then the computer vision has changed.